What's up, Bat Fam? Let's learn to fight like Batman. What's up, everyone? So today we're going to be talking about combat. It's probably something you've been looking forward to as far as learning what to do in the Batman miniature game. So we're going to be covering that here. We're going to be talking about close combat, we're going to be talking about range combat, we're going to be talking about how damage works and what that ends up meaning to your model. So let's just go down to the table and we'll get right into it. Alrighty, so you can see we have Batman and Joker set up on the board here, ready to throw down. We have the character cards all set up as though we've already raised our plan, allocating all of our counters to our different skills. So starting off with close combat attacks, that's going to be a bulk of what you're going to see in the Batman miniature game. That's going to be all of your unarmed strikes, all of your melee weapons. So if somebody has like an axe or a knife or something like that, this is how you're going to be doing all that. So to do a close combat attack, you do need to be within base contact of an enemy model, as you can see here. There are some traits, that allow you to be within 2 inches away, but that's, like Batman miniature game, there's always a trait that changes the rules. But to do a close combat attack, you need to spend attack counters, and for each attack counter you spend, it's going to basically turn into a dice that you can use to attempt to hit. So let's start with Batman here. Batman has 5 counters allocated to his attack, so he's going to spend all 5 of those counters, and what that's going to do is that's going to turn into 5 dice. Those 5 dice he's going to be able to roll and attempt to hit Joker. When attempting to hit in melee combat, you need to roll equal to or higher than your opponent's defense. So as you can see here on the Joker card, it says he has a defense of 4. That's going to be the skill right here. You can't see the name of defense because it's covered by the dice, but he's got a defense of 4. So Batman's going to need to roll 4 or better to actually land a hit. So he's going to roll these 5 dice. We're going to see what happens. All right, so pretty successful. It looks like we have 3 successes already. And because this Batman has close combat master, he's actually going to be able to roll some failed hit rolls. So we get a free re-roll. That's going to score us an extra hit. So we have 4 hits. And then at this point, the opponent would have the ability to use defense counters and try and block that, which is exactly what Joker's going to do. So Joker would spend his 3 defense counters. Actually, let's move these right here. So he'd spend his 3 defense counters, and he'd be able to roll 3 dice to try and block those hits. When trying to block, you need to roll equal to or higher than the attacking model's attack rating. So Batman has an attack of 5. Joker's looking for 5s or better to try and block those hits. And as you can see, it looks like he blocked 1 of those. So we're going to negate 1 of those, and then it looks like Batman has 3 successes. So that's how you determine hits. Once you reach this point, you would then take these 3 successes, add a collateral damage die, and then you'd roll that for damage. We'll be covering damage later on in the video. I just kind of want to show you how all the attacks work first, and then we'll go into damage in the end. But that's how all the close combat stuff works. And then, of course, like I said, you just move on to the damage phase of the attack. Close combat weapons work exactly the same. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that oftentimes they're going to have traits that will allow you to do re-rolls at certain points or give you certain bonuses. Like Joker's poison knife here has sharp, which allows him to re-roll failed damage rolls. So that's kind of nice. It kind of helps make sure that if you hit, you're going to do damage. And yeah. So as far as some modifiers that can be applied to close combat, if a model is outnumbered, it's going to suffer some penalties here. During close combat, if it's outnumbered by 2 or more enemy models, what's going to happen is that its defense value was going to be -1. So if you kind of gang up on a model, you're going to be able to kind of lower their defense, and all those guys are going to have an easier time taking them down. So dogpiling on Batman is not exactly a bad idea, especially if you have like a swarm of low-level henchmen. So that's being outnumbered. Blocking close combat attacks, we talked about all that. And then now we're going to talk about close combat, like special attacks. So it's going to be like grabbing and pushing. So starting with grabbing, let's have Joker grab Batman. So now that Batman's activated, we'll say that Joker has taken some damage. Like I said, we'll get into that later. Now it's going to be Joker's activation. So what he's going to do is he's going to try and grab Batman, try and hold him down. When you're grabbing an enemy model, what ends up happening is that the opposing model gets a pin down effect. Pin down models can't spend movement counters, and their attack value is reduced by 1. It can break out of this by doing a successful strength check, but it does cost an attack counter to attempt to break out. So you need to keep that in mind. If you're trying to lock down an opponent's model, grabbing them might be a really good option. So Joker's going to attempt to do that right now. To do that, you're going to do a close combat attack just like we just did. But the difference is that you do need to spend a special counter in addition to your attack counters. So Joker will spend 4 attack counters and 1 special counter to declare his grab attack. You do need to declare any kind of special attacks in the beginning. You can't just tack that on to the end. That's not cool. So let's see here. Oh, so get everything back in place here. Yeah, there we go. So Batman has a defense of 4. So he is going to get 1 success, or actually 2 successes, sorry. Batman has some defense dice, but for sake of, showing you how to do this, he's not going to spend them here. So Joker then would successfully grab Batman, and Batman would be kind of pinned down. So that's kind of nice. So the opposite of grabbing, of course, is going to be kind of pushing. So we'll kind of set up some attack counters here and everything like it was. And we'll say that Batman's trying to push Joker away now. To push a model, you're basically going to do the exact same thing as grabbing, so you just need to spend 1 additional special counter in addition to all of your attack counters that you're spending to attempt the attack. So if Batman wanted to push Joker, he could spend his 5 attack counters and 1 special counter to try and push. Rolling 5 dice and trying to roll over Joker's defense of 4. Okay, so it looks like we have 4 successes. Reroll that because of Close Combat Master. Looks like we have 5 successes. Joker's going to have a bad day. So all of the damage that would be applied in your close combat attack is going to be on your character card for melee weapons. If you're doing an unarmed strike, naturally your character is only going to do 1 stun damage. That being said, a lot of cards have the trait Reinforced Gloves. What that does is that makes your unarmed strikes do 2 stun damage. So this Batman has that. He can actually, with this roll, end up doing 10 stun damage, which would knock out most models. So that would still be applied, and he would also do his push. So we're going to say that, for some reason Joker didn't get knocked out by that, and we'll apply the push effect. So when a target is pushed, it's pushed directly away from the model that made the attack, and the distance is determined by what the collateral damage die says. So when you roll your damage, depending on what this says, the opposing model is going to move half that amount in inches, of course, to a minimum of 1 inch. So if you roll, 5, you'd end up moving about 2.5 inches away from your model. So you'd measure that out. Like I said, you'd do that directly away from your opposing model. And what that would actually do is that would push Joker into this little barricade here. Now what would happen if you run into terrain and other pieces like that, maybe not this because you can actually pass over that, but if you were to run into scenery or that kind of stuff, you would actually get to roll a damage roll against them. It would be a strength 4 plus roll with a damage of 1 stun. So if Joker was to, get pushed into a wall or something like that, you'd be able to roll a d6, and we got, 4 or better, which got a 5, so he would actually suffer 1 additional stun on top of all the other damage that we've already done. Of course, if you push a model off the ledge of a building or, some sort of, piece of scenery, they're going to fall. So you would apply all the normal falling damage rules that we talked about in the previous video with movement. One thing to note about pushing, vehicle model can only be pushed by large or huge models. Large models can only be pushed by large or huge models. A huge model can only be pushed by other huge models, and a model cannot be pushed off the edge of the gaming area, meaning that you cannot push somebody out of bounds. So, do keep that in mind. Treat it as, kind of an impassable barrier. So that's, all the close combat stuff for the most part. We talked about, grabbing, breaking out of the grab. That's just a strength check that you have to make. Of course, spending an attack counter to do that. Yeah, so that's pretty much everything as far as close combat's concerned. I'm going to switch some stuff up and then we'll get right into ranged combat. Now that we got everything all switched around here, let's talk a little bit about line of sight. Before we get into ranged combat, I do want to make a little note because I didn't really talk about volume before. The volume of your model is basically what can be targeted. So think of it as like a cylinder that goes from the edge of your base up to the very top of your model. So it's really just a big cylinder with that ends at the top. Any bits that are hanging over the edge, like if you have like Batgirl and her fist or something is hanging over the edge, or Batman's cape here, that doesn't really count. So if an enemy model can see that doesn't matter. What's important is that they can see the base. So I'll kind of give you an example right here of what that actually kind of looks like and means. So you have Gustav here. He's going to be our Carbine prisoner from the resin set. Hopefully you know him well. He is a pretty good model for his value. So I got a little laser pointer out here that I have from Army Painter. You can get it at most game stores. I recommend it. But as you can see here, let's scoot Batman back just a smidge. There's no part of Gustav's model here that's actually going to be able to really see Batman's base. But of course you can see that his cape's poking out, so he can see the cape, but he can't see the base. So Gustav actually wouldn't be able to target Batman in this scenario, meaning he doesn't actually have line of sight. So now that we've covered that, because that is an important note, we'll kind of get into ranged combat here. So now let's get on to ranged attacks. Ranged attacks are a little bit different from close combat attacks in that you don't spend a number of counters to determine how many hits you're going to be able to try and attempt. What you would do instead is that you spend 2 attack counters, and that will allow you to make a ranged attack. The number of dice that you would actually roll to hit is determined by your weapon and will be listed under the rate of fire. That's going to be the third column in the weapon section there with the little reticle. So you can see Gustav here has 5 right next to his little scope symbol. So he's going to be able to roll 5 dice when attacking with that weapon. You need to have at least 1 ammo to use that weapon to attack. Seems like it kind of makes sense, but it's worth mentioning. If you don't have ammo, you can't use the weapon. The target also must be within line of sight. We talked about volume and everything like that, so you know that you're targeting your model and you're not just targeting the cape. And you also need to not be in contact with an enemy model. So if Gustav here was in contact with Batgirl, he would not be able to make a ranged attack because he's in the middle of a fist fight with her. There are weapons that will allow you to do that, and they will have the trait light. You can see here on Batman's card, his Batling here, he can use even if he's in close combat with another model. So that's kind of how that works. Another thing to keep in mind is during your activation, you are only able to do one type of attack. You can only do a ranged attack or a melee attack. You cannot do both during the same activation. Of course, there are some traits that will allow you to change that because Batman loves traits that change rules. They're great. I'm not going to complain about them, but they do always change up all the different rules. So do keep that in mind and read all of that stuff in the compendium. Right. So we've talked about how you spend your attack counters. So we'll have Gustav spend 2 attack counters to try and shoot at Batman here. We'll pop him out from behind cover here, so we don't have to worry about that yet. We'll talk about cover here in a second. So you determine line of sight. The first thing you pretty much do, as long as their bases end up, being in contact with each other. They are within 12 inches because that is your base line of sight. Of course, that they're well within that, so that's not a problem. So Gustav would be able to do that. So he'd spend his 2 attack counters. he would get his 5 attack dice because that is his rate of fire for his weapon. He would then roll those. Just like close combat, you roll equal to or higher than your opponent's defense. So let's see here. He would end up rolling 3 successes, it looks like. And let's see here. Yep, that's that. So he's got his 3 successes, and then he would then turn those into damage rolls. Unlike close combat, you cannot spend defense counters to try and block ranged attacks. You can, however, use movement counters if you have the trait Dodge or Acrobat. Acrobat grants you the trait Dodge, so as long as you have access to that trait, you're going to be able to spend movement counters to try and dodge the attack. To do that, you do that just like a defense roll, but instead of spending defense counters, you would spend movement counters. So if you have a Nightwing or one of those super dodgy characters, you can always try and keep a couple movement counters on the card to be able to dodge ranged attacks later. So Batman doesn't have that luxury though, so he's not going to be able to dodge any of these attacks. However, he does have Bat Armor, which would basically give him a chance to negate the damage from that hit. But we'll not worry about that right now. We're just talking about ranged attacks, so talk about Bat Armor some other time. So as it would stand here, he would end up rolling these 3 dice with a collateral damage die, determine damage, and then you move on from there. So let's say if Batman was behind a little bit of terrain here. So if any part of the model's base is behind some scenery, if there's something in between them, even if it's just a little bit, so like even if you can make a clear line, if there is a portion of that model that's covered, you're going to get what's called a ping roll. And the ping roll is what's going to kind of determine if the ranged attack hits the piece of terrain instead of the model. So any successes that you've made, so like if Gustav had his 3 successes here, what would end up happening is that Batman would then end up rolling 3 dice to see if those actually hit the wall instead of him. To determine success on a ping roll, you need to roll 4 or better. So let's see here. Looks like Batman would have negated 2 of those hits with the ping, so 2 bullets went into the wall here, and 1 ends up actually making it through to Batman. Then you would continue on with the damage roll from there. So you take all the misses away, and you're left with what's left. Add your collateral damage die, and then you roll that to see how well you do. So that's pretty much how ping works. If there are multiple objects in the way, then you need to roll ping for each object. So if there's a dumpster over here or whatever, if there's more barricades or something, who knows. If there is those, you do need to take those into account and make those ping rolls. And that's pretty much that. We talked about dodging, so to spend movement counters. Up next, I guess we'll talk about damage then. Also, side note that if you move prior to doing a ranged attack, your rate of fire is reduced to 1. So it doesn't matter what weapon you have, unless it has the trait Assault, your weapon is reduced to 1 rate of fire. So keep that in mind. If you have a high rate of fire, but you don't have the Assault trait, you don't want to move that character prior to doing your ranged attack. You want to kind of have them fire and then move, not move then fire. This guy fortunately has the Assault trait, and he has Assault 3, meaning instead of having only 1 dice to use after moving, he would have 3 dice to attack with. So that's kind of nice. It gives him a little bit more mobility, but that is something that you do need to keep in mind when you're playing. So we're going to talk about damage a little bit here now. First we'll cover how close combat damage works and what you would end up doing with that. Let's have Batman here since they're in close combat. So Batman rolled 3 successful hit rolls. He would take those successes, add a collateral damage dice to it. So you want to make sure that you have a dice that's going to be a different color, different size, something that you're going to be able to determine it and keep it separate from the rest of them. So you'd roll those successes with your collateral damage dice, and you'd see what ends up happening here. In close combat, so with melee and unarmed strikes, you need to look at the strength of your character. and that's going to determine if they're successful in damaging. Batman has a strength of 3+, so he needs to roll 3 or better to land a successful damage. And it looks like he gets 3 successful damage rolls, which means he would apply his damage 3 times over. Him having reinforced gloves, that means it would be 2 stun damage for each successful damage roll, meaning Gustav here would suffer 6 stun damage in total. That being said, his endurance is only 5, so he would take 5 stun damage, and you would end up marking that on his card here, and he would be considered knocked out. It's good to have different colored dice to represent the different colors of damage. He only has stun damage, so I'm only putting that one on there, but just kind of showing you it's good to have 2 different colors so you can kind of keep that separate and know what's what. So he would end up being knocked out. You can lay the model down if you want, but keep it standing really, because you can't move through knocked out models, and you want to, really their base is the only thing that's affecting that space. So if you lay them out, you're creating area that you can't really move through that you should be able to, but whatever. So that's that. So Gustav would be knocked out here. So let's talk about what that would mean. When a model becomes KO, they lose all of their remaining action counters. So if he had action counters, they would be gone. Things that a KO model can't do is they cannot generate action counters during the raise the plan phase, and they cannot be activated. Knocked out models do not create ping rolls, so you can shoot over them. That's not considered an obstacle. Knocked out models also cannot control or contest objectives. So if you and an opponent are both sitting on an objective and you knock them out, then you would then end up controlling the objective because they can't oppose you. They're knocked out on the ground. Let's see here. I think that's pretty much it. Once a model becomes knocked out, any additional damage that's caused to the model is basically ignored. So as you saw, Batman did 6 damage, but Gustav only took 5 because he only has 5 endurance. Let's talk about coup de grace. So if a model's knocked out and you want to basically finish him off and turn him into a casualty, what you can then do is you can do any sort of attack to them. And when making your damage roll, each successful dice allows you to convert 1 stun damage into an injury marker on the enemy model. The example that they give you here in the game is that a model with claws makes a strike against a KO enemy, successfully hitting and damaging twice. Each attack causes 1 injury and 1 stun. However, thanks to coup de grace, those stun markers are converted immediately into injury, so the strike inflicts, 2 blood instead. The importance of that is that once your character has suffered their endurance worth of injury markers, they are considered a casualty. So let's say if Gustav had, instead of 5 stun markers, he had 5 injury markers, he'd be considered a casualty, he would be removed from the board, and people would end up burying him in the ground later. And that's pretty much how that works. We talked about collateral damage and the special critical effects that characters can have. So let's kind of just go over a little bit of the attack sequence summary so you can kind of know the order of everything. We already talked about it, but just for good measure, let's kind of burn through it real quick. So the first thing you do when you're making your attack is you select a model. Second thing you do is make your hit roll. Once you've made your hit roll, you determine if you have successes and fails. You take those successes. If you're making a ranged attack, you would then make a ping roll. At that point, any trait or any character that has the bodyguard trait would then be able to activate that trait, meaning that they could end up diverting the hits to themselves instead of the person next to them. Also during that time, you can dodge or block. Defensive traits that cancel out hits like bad armor and stuff like that would also be applied at this point. After all that's done, then you would make your damage roll. So you can't make your damage roll and then be like, oh hey, I want to block that. No, you can't do that. It's too late. Then you would make your damage roll. After you do that, you can do any of your rerolls for damage and all your rerolls for collateral. You would do those at the same time. So if you have brutal and sharp, you would reroll your damage and your crit at the same time, and that would be really good to roll because you would knock down. You would also critical, and both those, all that success, so that's good. Okay, let's see here. The last thing that you would do is after you've re-rolled all your damage dice and that's all determined, you deal damage like we talked about. So you apply the injury damage, then you apply the stun damage, and you determine if the model is knocked out or a casualty. Side note, Joker has the ability Luck. Luck allows you to force a re-roll on pretty much anything at any point. So keep that in mind. If you're running Joker, you can kind of be like, no, let's re-roll that ping roll. So that's kind of fun. So we've covered attacking and damaging and all that good stuff. Let's talk about healing, because I mentioned it previously in the video where I talked about the different phases of the game, how in the recount phase you can attempt to try and shrug off some stun damage. So I'm going to tell you how you can do that. You can also try and attempt to wake up from being knocked out, which is kind of nice. It's always great to have a model come back on the board after it's been knocked out for a couple rounds. So let's start with how you can shrug off some stun damage. Models who are not knocked out but have accumulated stun markers can try and shrug those off. How you do that is you roll 1d6 for each model that has at least one stun marker. On a result of 4+, you can remove a stun marker. So that's kind of nice. Let's see here. If a model still has unspent special counters during that round, they can spend them now to add extra dice. Each success removes an additional stun marker. So if you have a couple special counters that you forgot to use or you just didn't really have a good chance to, you can kind of use those to try and heal, which is super sweet. So if you have a character that's knocked out though, it's going to be a little bit different. You can try and wake up from that, and how you do that is you would make an endurance roll. We talked about that in a previous video about all the different skill rolls, and that's how you would do that. So you would make an endurance roll. If you pass the endurance roll, what you do is you would end up removing one stun marker, and you would no longer have the knocked out effect. That being said, the model would still be considered knocked down, so it would be prone, still be laying on the ground, but you'd be able to activate them and add counters to them at the beginning of the next round. So that's pretty much how attacking, damage, and combat works for the most part. I think we pretty much covered everything. If I forgot something, put it in the comments. If I got something wrong, call me out on it and I'll tag it up there so people don't get it wrong in the future. But yeah, that should be that. Right on, guys. Sorry it took so long. I've been working on a lot of wedding stuff for a friend of mine. We've been doing decorations and doing all that kind of stuff, so I haven't been able to post a ton of stuff. But that's all done now, so hopefully I'll be able to pump out content a little bit quicker. So keep an eye out. Hopefully I'll have the rest of this series out soon. And yeah, I think that's going to cover it. Oh, it's over? If you liked the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to turn on notifications and subscribe if you want to stay up to date on everything related to Batman Miniatures game. Well, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you guys again. See you on the streets of Gotham.